The scratching started at exactly 6:47 a.m. Sarah's eyes snapped open to the sound of something clawing against her bedroom window, long, deliberate scrapes that made her teeth ache. She lay frozen in bed, watching the morning light seep through the edges of her hastily drawn blinds, casting thin golden lines across her trembling hands. The scratching continued, methodical and patient, as if whatever was outside knew she was listening. She had broken the only rule. The rental agreement had been crystal clear. All blinds must remain closed from sunrise to sunset, no exceptions. She had laughed when she first read it, thinking it was some quirky landlord's attempt at preserving the furniture from sun damage. But now, as the scratching grew more insistent and something wet began to drip down her window, Sarah realized she should have taken Mrs. Holloway's warning seriously. Welcome back to my channel, night crawlers. I'm coming to you from my dimly lit studio because tonight's story, it's different. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And whatever you do, make sure your blinds are closed. Trust me on this one. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell because we're about to explore a rental agreement that came with a price no tenant should ever have to pay. Give this video a like if you believe some rules exist for reasons we're not meant to understand. The scratching stopped, but Sarah knew it would be back at sunset. 3 weeks earlier, Sarah Chen had been desperate. Her divorce from Mark had left her financially drained, emotionally exhausted, and in dire need of affordable housing in a city where studio apartments cost more than most people's monthly salaries. When she stumbled across the Craigslist listing for a fully furnished 2-bedroom house in Millbrook Heights, a quiet suburban neighborhood 30 minutes outside the city for less than half the market rate, she couldn't believe her luck. The house itself was charming in an old-fashioned way. Built in the 1940s, it featured hardwood floors, crown molding, and large windows that should have filled every room with natural light. Should have, because every single window was covered by heavy dark curtains and thick wooden blinds that appeared to be permanently drawn shut. Mrs. Holloway, the elderly landlord, had met Sarah at the property with a ring of old-fashioned keys and a manila folder containing the lease. She was a small woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a long coat despite the warm September weather. The rent includes utilities, furnished rooms, and garden maintenance. Mrs. Holloway had explained, her voice carrying a slight tremor that Sarah attributed to age. There's only one rule, dear. One very important rule. Sarah had nodded politely, already mentally arranging her belongings in the spacious rooms. All blinds and curtains must remain closed from sunrise to sunset. Every single one. Every single day. Mrs. Holloway's pale blue eyes had fixed on Sarah with unusual intensity. I cannot stress this enough. The previous tenants who ignored this rule, well, they're no longer with us. Sarah had assumed the woman was being dramatic about former tenants breaking their lease early. The house had a slightly stale smell, as if it had been closed up for months, and she noticed that even the kitchen window above the sink was covered by a thick Roman shade. But the price was right. The location was perfect for her new job at the local marketing firm, and she desperately needed a fresh start. Of course, Sarah had agreed easily. Privacy is important. Mrs. Holloway had smiled then, but it hadn't reached her eyes. Good girl. The house will take care of you as long as you take care of it. That night, Sarah had moved in with her few remaining possessions, grateful to finally have a space of her own. She'd noticed a few oddity scratches around the window frames, deadbolts on every door, including interior ones, and a peculiar collection of mirrors positioned strategically throughout the house. But she'd attributed these quirks to the previous owner's paranoia about security. For the first 2 weeks, Sarah had followed the rule religiously. She'd wake up in the pre-dawn darkness, shower, and dress by lamplight, then leave for work while the house remained shrouded in artificial twilight. She'd return each evening to draw back the curtains and blinds, finally allowing the house to breathe in the fading daylight. But this morning had been different. This morning, Sarah had overslept. Sarah's phone alarm had failed to go off, the victim of a power outage that had struck sometime during the night. When she finally jolted awake, sunlight was already streaming through the gaps in her bedroom blinds, creating bright rectangles on the carpet that seemed to pulse with an unnatural intensity. Panicked about being late for her presentation at work, Sarah had rushed to the window to check the time by the position of the sun. Without thinking, she'd yanked open the blinds completely. That's when she saw the garden. In the 3 weeks she'd lived there, Sarah had only seen the backyard in the evening twilight. A typical suburban landscape with overgrown grass, a few mature trees, and what appeared to be an old garden shed at the far end. But now, in the full light of morning, she could see that something was terribly wrong. The grass wasn't just overgrown, it was moving, writhing in patterns that had nothing to do with wind, creating spirals and symbols that hurt to look at directly. The trees, which she'd thought were simply large oaks, revealed themselves to be something else entirely. Their bark was too smooth, too gray, and their branches moved with deliberate intention, reaching toward the house like gnarled fingers. But it was the shed that made Sarah's blood run cold. It wasn't a shed at all. It was a structure made of what looked like bones, massive yellowed bones arranged in a rough rectangle and covered with what might have been skin or hide. Steam rose from its surface, and she could see dark stains spreading outward from its base into the writhing grass. And there were shapes moving around it. Tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to glide rather than walk their elongated limbs, casting shadows that fell in the wrong directions. Even from her second-story window, Sarah could see that their faces were wrong, too angular, with features that shifted and blurred when she tried to focus on them. One of them looked up at her window. Sarah stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The thing's face was a void, a space where features should have been that seemed to pull light into it rather than reflect it. And as she watched in horror, it began to move toward the house. She slammed the blinds shut, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the cord. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she backed away from the window, but the damage was done. She had looked, and something had looked back. That's when the scratching started. It began softly, almost tentatively, like a cat asking to come inside, but it quickly grew more insistent, more demanding. The sound came from multiple windows, now her bedroom, the bathroom, the guest room. Long scraping sounds that suggested claws or talons dragging across glass and wood. Sarah grabbed her phone and called Mrs. Holloway, but the call went straight to voicemail. She tried again, then again, her panic mounting with each failed attempt. The scratching was getting louder now, and she could hear what sounded like whispers seeping through the walls, voices speaking in a language that made her brain feel fuzzy and unfocused. She ran to the living room window, the largest in the house, and peeked through a tiny gap in the curtains. The front yard looked normal green grass mailbox, the street beyond with its neat row of suburban homes. But she could see shadows moving along the sides of the house, converging on the windows like moths drawn to flame. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a new sound that was somehow worse, a gentle tapping, as if someone were politely requesting entry. The tapping moved from window to window, circling the house in a methodical pattern. Sarah realized with growing horror that whatever was outside was testing each entry point, looking for a way in, and she had given them a reason to try. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "You looked. Now they know you're there. Keep the blinds closed until sunset. Do not look again. Do not let them in." The tapping stopped. In the sudden silence, Sarah could hear her own ragged breathing and the tick of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. She checked the time, 7:15 a.m. Sunset wouldn't come for nearly 12 hours. She was trapped in her own home, surrounded by things that shouldn't exist, waiting for darkness to fall. The first hour passed in relative quiet, and Sarah began to hope that whatever was outside had lost interest and moved on. She made coffee with shaking hand, the familiar routine helping to ground her in reality. Maybe she'd imagined it all. Maybe the stress of the divorce and the move had finally caught up with her, causing some kind of breakdown. But at 8:30 a.m., her phone rang. "Sarah, this is Mrs. Holloway." The elderly woman's voice sounded strained, urgent. "I got your messages. Tell me exactly what happened." Sarah explained about oversleeping, about opening the blinds, about what she'd seen in the backyard. Mrs. Holloway listened in silence, and when Sarah finished, there was a long pause. "Oh dear," Mrs. Holloway said finally. "Oh dear. You must listen to me very carefully now. They know you're aware of them, which means they'll try everything to get inside before sunset. The house has protections, but they're not perfect. You must not open any door, any window, anything that could give them access. And whatever you do, do not look outside again." "What are they?" Sarah whispered. "Older than this town, older than memory." They've always been here, feeding on the boundary between light and shadow. During the day, sunlight makes them hungry, makes them desperate. They can only exist in the spaces between dawn and dusk, the edges of vision, the corners where shadow meets light. That's why the blinds must stay closed. Without shadows to hide in, without the interplay of light and dark, they can't fully manifest. A sound from upstairs made Sarah freeze. It sounded like footsteps in the guest room, slow and deliberate. "Mrs. Holloway," Sarah breathed. "I think something's inside." The line went dead. Sarah grabbed a kitchen knife and crept toward the stairs. The footsteps had stopped, but she could hear something else now, a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. As she climbed the stairs, the temperature dropped noticeably, and her breath began to mist in the air. The guest room door was slightly ajar, though Sarah was certain she'd left it closed. Through the gap, she could see movement shadows dancing across the wall in patterns that defied the stationary furniture. The humming grew louder, and underneath it, she could hear what sounded like children singing a lullaby in that same incomprehensible language. Sarah pushed the door open with the tip of her knife. The room was empty, but the blinds were moving. Not swaying as if from a breeze, but undulating like water, like living things. The shadows on the walls weren't being cast by anything in the room. They moved independently, reaching toward the center of the space where Sarah stood. One of the shadows detached itself from the wall. It rose from the floor like smoke, gradually taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. Sarah could see through it, but it was solid enough to cast its own shadow, a shadow that was darker than the absence of light, so black it seemed to pull everything around it into its depths. The shadow thing tilted its head, studying her with senses she couldn't understand. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere at once: the walls, the floor, the air, itself. "You saw us." Sarah backed toward the door, but more shadows were emerging from the corners of the room. They moved like liquid mercury, flowing across surfaces and pooling in the spaces between furniture. The temperature continued to drop, and frost began forming on the windows despite the warm September day outside. "We have been waiting." The shadows began to converge, reaching for her with tendrils of living darkness. Sarah turned and ran, slamming the door behind her and racing down the stairs. Behind her, she could hear the door rattling violently in its frame, as if something was throwing itself against it. She reached the living room and collapsed onto the couch, her entire body shaking. The knife clattered to the floor as she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to process what she'd just experienced. The sound from upstairs had stopped, but she could feel eyes on her, watching from every shadow in the house. Her phone buzzed with another text. "They're inside now. The house protections are weakening. Find the mirrors. Use the mirrors." Sarah looked around the living room and noticed for the first time how strategically placed the mirrors were. There was one above the fireplace, another by the front door, and a third positioned to reflect light from the hallway. In fact, now that she was paying attention, she could see mirrors in every room she'd been in: small ones, large ones, antique and modern, all angled in ways that seemed random but were clearly purposeful. As she watched, something flickered in the mirror above the fireplace. Not a reflection of the room, but something else, a vast space filled with shifting geometric shapes and that same gray, too smooth substance she'd seen on the trees outside. And moving through that space were hundreds of the tall, thin figures, all turning toward the mirror as if they could see her watching them. One of them pressed its face against the glass from the other side. Sarah screamed and threw a couch cushion at the mirror, but when she looked again, it showed only the normal reflection of the room. But now she understood. The mirrors weren't just decorative, they were windows, and something on the other side was trying to push through. The scratching returned, louder than before, coming from every window in the house. The shadows in the room began to deepen and move, reaching toward the mirrors like iron filings drawn to a magnet. And somewhere in the walls, Sarah could hear them singing again, that same children's lullaby that made her thoughts feel thick and sluggish. She checked her phone, 2:17 p.m., still hours until sunset. The house around her groaned and settled, but Sarah was beginning to suspect it wasn't the normal sounds of an old building. It was the sound of something trying to push its way in from a place that existed alongside reality, but just out of sight. And with each passing minute, she could feel them getting closer. By 5 p.m., the house had become a battleground between two realities. Sarah huddled in the kitchen, surrounded by every mirror she'd been able to remove from the walls and arrange in a protective circle around herself. She'd discovered that when the mirrors faced outward, the shadows couldn't approach as closely. They writhed and pulled back as if the reflective surfaces caused them physical pain. But the mirrors also showed her things she didn't want to see. In the bathroom mirror, she'd watched one of the tall figures methodically examining every inch of the house's exterior, running its elongated fingers along the window frames and doors, searching for weaknesses. In the bedroom mirror, she'd seen the thing that lived in the garden shed, a mass of writhing flesh and too many eyes that pulsed with a sick yellow light. And in the antique mirror from the hallway, she'd seen the truth about the previous tenants. They hadn't moved out. They were still there, trapped in the space between the mirrors, their faces pressed against the glass from the other side. Sarah had counted at least 6 different people, men, women, a teenage boy who couldn't have been more than 16. All of them reaching toward her, mouths open in silent screams, their eyes pleading for help she didn't know how to give. Mrs. Holloway hadn't lied about the previous tenants no longer being with them. They'd been absorbed, pulled through the mirrors into whatever hellish dimension existed on the other side. At 5:30, the assault on the house intensified. The scratching became a constant din, as if dozens of creatures were clawing at every surface simultaneously. The windows began to rattle in their frames, and Sarah could see the blinds moving more violently now, as if something was pushing against them from outside. The temperature in the house had dropped so low that her breath came in steady puffs of white vapor. Then the whispers started. They came from the walls themselves, seeping through the paint and plaster like water through cracks. At first, they were in that alien language, but gradually they shifted to English, broken, distorted English that hurt to listen to. "Let us in. We know you're there. You belong with us now." Anna pressed her hands over her ears, but the voices seemed to come from inside her head as much as from the walls. The mirrors around her began to fog up, despite the cold, and in the condensation, words began to appear as if written by invisible fingers. "Open, door. Let us in. You cannot hide forever. We are hungry." The lights went out. In the sudden darkness, the only illumination came from the mirrors themselves, which had begun to glow with a sickly phosphorescent light. Sarah could see shapes moving in their depths, not reflections but actual beings existing in the mirror space, pressing against the glass from their side. That's when she heard the sound that nearly broke her sanity, the front door slowly creaking open. Impossible. She'd checked the locks, the deadbolts, the chain. Everything was secure. But she could hear footsteps in the entryway, slow and deliberate, accompanied by a wet sliding sound as if something was dragging itself across the floor. "Sarah." The voice that called her name was almost human, but not quite. It had too many harmonics, too many undertones, like multiple voices speaking in perfect synchronization. "Sarah, we've come to take you home." She peered around the kitchen doorway and nearly screamed. The front hall was full of them. Tall, impossible figures that seemed to be made of shadow and starlight, their forms constantly shifting between semi-human and something altogether alien. They moved like liquid darkness, given purpose, flowing across the walls and ceiling as easily as across the floor. And leading them was something that might once have been Mrs. Holloway. The thing wearing her form was close to the original but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with joints that bent in directions human joints shouldn't bend. Its face was a constantly shifting approximation of the elderly landlord, features sliding and reforming as Sarah watched. "The mirrors won't protect you forever, dear," the Mrs. Holloway thing said, its voice carrying that same multiple-toned quality. "They're just another door, and we have keys to every door." The beings began moving toward the kitchen, and Sarah realized with growing horror that they cast no reflections in her protective circle of mirrors. They existed in the spaces between reflection and reality, and as they approached, the mirrors began to crack. Sarah grabbed her phone and typed a desperate message to the unknown number that had been helping her. "They're inside. What do I do?" The response came immediately. "Break all the mirrors. Break them now. Don't let them take you through." "Break them," Sarah whispered, but even as she questioned it, she understood. The mirrors weren't just windows, they were doorways. And if she could destroy the doorways? She grabbed the kitchen knife and brought it down hard on the closest mirror. The glass shattered with a sound like screaming, and several of the shadow figures stumbled backward as if struck. The Mrs. Holloway thing let out a shriek of rage that shattered every remaining glass in the kitchen. "Stop her!" it commanded. Sarah moved faster than she'd ever moved in her life, smashing mirror after mirror, while the beings surged toward her. Each shattered reflection sent out a pulse of light that drove the creatures back, but they were adapting, learning to move through the bright flashes. She destroyed the hallway mirror and watched 3 of the trapped tenants fade away with expressions of gratitude. She shattered the bathroom mirror and felt the temperature in the house begin to rise. But there was still one mirror left, the large antique one above the fireplace in the living room. The shadow beings blocked her path, but Sarah noticed something crucial as each mirror broke. They became more solid, more vulnerable to physical laws. She could see them more clearly now, which meant they were being forced fully into this reality. She feinted left, then dove right, rolling past their grasping tendrils and into the living room. The antique mirror loomed above the fireplace, its surface showing not the room, but a swirling vortex of darkness and impossible geometries. Sarah raised the knife, but the Mrs. Holloway thing caught her wrist. "You'll doom us all." It hissed its face, now barely recognizable as human. "We need the space between. Without the mirrors, without the shadows, we'll be trapped here forever." "Good!" Sarah gasped and brought her knee up into what she hoped was still a vulnerable spot. The creature doubled over and Sarah broke free, plunging the knife into the mirror's surface. The explosion of light that followed was beyond anything she'd experienced. It filled every corner of the house, burning away shadows and revealing the creatures for what they truly were, ancient hungry things that had been feeding on the boundary between worlds for centuries. As the light consumed them, Sarah heard their final screams, and then silence. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was lying on the living room floor in a pool of sunlight. The blinds were open, the curtains drawn back, and warm afternoon light streamed through every window in the house. She could hear birds singing outside and the distant sound of children playing in the neighborhood. She sat up slowly, her body aching as if she'd run a marathon. The mirrors were gone, not just broken, but completely absent, leaving only clean spaces on the walls where they'd once hung. The scratches around the window frames were gone too, and the house felt normal. Just an old house with good bones and plenty of natural light. Sarah's phone showed missed calls from Mrs. Holloway, the real Mrs. Holloway, she hoped. When she called back, the elderly woman answered on the first ring. "Sarah? Oh, thank goodness. I've been trying to reach you all day. There was some kind of electrical storm that knocked out phone service in my area. How are you holding up?" Sarah paused, looking around the transformed house. "I think I'm okay. Mrs. Holloway about the rule about keeping the blinds closed." "What rule, dear? I don't recall any such thing. Though I suppose if you prefer privacy, that's entirely up to you. I hope you're settling in well." Sarah frowned. It was as if the woman had no memory of their previous conversation, no recollection of the warnings or the mysterious text messages. She wondered if breaking the mirrors had somehow reset everything, erasing the supernatural infestation along with any memory of it. But as she hung up the phone, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. There, on the coffee table, where no coffee table had been before, lay a manila folder. The same folder Mrs. Holloway had carried when she'd first shown Sarah the house. Inside was a lease agreement, but not the one Sarah remembered signing. This lease had different terms, different conditions, and at the bottom in spidery handwriting was a new rule. Tenant must maintain house mirrors in good condition. Replacement mirrors will be provided as needed. 3 days later, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside were 7 mirrors of various sizes, each wrapped in tissue paper and accompanied by a small card that read, "For your protection and ours, the management." Sarah stared at the mirrors for a long time, then carried them to the garage and locked them away. She would not hang them. She would not give those things another doorway into her reality. But that night, as she was getting ready for bed, she noticed something odd about the dark windows. Without blinds or curtains to cover them, they reflected the interior of the house perfectly. And in those reflections, Sarah could see shadows moving that weren't being cast by anything in the room. She rushed to close the blinds she'd finally purchased that afternoon, but as she reached for the cord, she saw something that made her freeze. Standing in her backyard, barely visible in the darkness beyond the porch light's reach, was a familiar figure. Tall, impossibly thin, with elongated limbs and a face that was more void than flesh. It stood perfectly still, watching her window, waiting. Sarah yanked the blinds closed and backed away from the window. She grabbed her phone and checked the time, 11:47 p.m. Still hours until sunrise. The scratching started again. This time it came from inside the house. Sarah ran to the garage and threw open the door, grabbing the first mirror from the box. As she carried it back into the house, she could hear them moving in the walls, skittering, flowing, whispering her name in voices that sounded almost grateful. She hung the mirror in the living room with shaking hands and immediately felt their presence settle, becoming less frantic, more patient. In the mirror's surface, she could see shapes moving in that space between realities, and she understood the truth with crushing clarity. The creatures hadn't been destroyed when she broke the mirrors. They'd been trapped in this reality, in her reality, forced to exist in the spaces between shadow and light, without their interdimensional refuge. Breaking the mirrors hadn't banished them, it had stranded them here, hungry and desperate with nowhere to go. The mirrors weren't prisons, they were feeding grounds. And now Sarah understood why Mrs. Holloway had no memory of the rule. The previous tenant before her had learned the same lessons Sarah was learning now. Once you let them in, once they know you exist, you become their keeper. You maintain their doorways, you give them access to the space between worlds, and in return, they let you live. The rental agreement had never been about following rules. It had been about recruiting a new caretaker, someone to tend to creatures that existed beyond human understanding but needed human cooperation to survive. Sarah looked at the mirror and saw her own reflection staring back, but behind her reflection she could see other figures. The previous tenants, all of them standing in that impossible space between the glass and reality. They weren't trapped there as punishment. They were there as guardians, eternal sentinels, making sure the doorway stayed open. One of them, a woman about her own age, stepped forward and pressed her hand against the glass. Her lips moved, and though no sound came through, Sarah could read her words, "Welcome to the job." Outside, the scratching stopped. The creatures had settled back into their interdimensional spaces, satisfied that their new caretaker understood her responsibilities. Sarah would hang the mirrors, she would maintain the doorways, and she would ensure that the boundary between worlds remained permeable. Because the alternative, leaving them stranded in a reality they could never truly inhabit, would mean watching them slowly devour everything around them until nothing remained but shadow and hunger. Sarah hung the second mirror in the hallway, then the third in the kitchen. As she worked, she could feel their gratitude washing over her like a cold tide, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would never leave this house. The rental came with one rule after all, just not the rule she'd thought. Some doors once opened could never be closed.